I call this House to order, and I call upon the Honorable Prime Minister to give a speech not exceeding 7 minutes with no grace. Hear, hear.
Is it okay if I introduce myself off time?
Yeah.
I'm Asha, my pronouns are she, her. I'm the Gov First Speaker for Morristown. If everybody's ready, I'll begin my speech now. Okay, in this speech I'm going to start with a plan, then some characterization before moving through two contentions. Okay, on the motion, the U.S. federal government should allow members of the armed forces to unionize. Our plan is to repeal 10 U.S. Code 976, that's a specific one reference in the motion, that basically prevents this from happening. Then we're going to create a system where there's going to be a vote on whether the military wants to unionize every year. This just basically ensures like the military isn't going to be able to completely union bust this. We're still going to ensure that there's like an opportunity for this to happen. Importantly, this doesn't guarantee a union happens, but it creates that option. The funding for this is none. Like if there is additional funding negotiated in a union contract, that comes from the defense budget. The enforcement, it happens at the U.S. federal government level. Implementation, like we'll have the vote next year. Then I want to do some characterization. If we were to pass a union in the military, what does it look like? I think it probably looks like your classic union working for labor conditions. Why is that? Because fundamentally, the vast majority of people working in the military in a time of peace, like the last 100 years, like the last 20 years, 30 years in the U.S., are fundamentally caring about many similar things. This looks like having less working hours, having more paid time off, having better pay when they're there, more benefits for their families, etc. We think that's pretty intuitive because that's the primary focus of the union if it is created. Okay, with that, let's get to our first contention on the impact to members of the armed forces, and our first subpoint here on economics. What we see is that currently 5% of people in the U.S. armed forces are making below the poverty rate. The base pay in the military is only $30K a year for soldiers. What we see is that this is a really big problem insofar as these are hard jobs that take a lot of time, and these people are simply not being paid enough to survive. Importantly, military recruitment often specifically targets low-income Black and brown communities where job prospects aren't good. Why is that? Because they know if they go to communities where they have better options, nobody will join the military. They're only going to places where they don't have better choices. What we see fundamentally is that when we implement this union, we're really likely to see wages going up because using collective bargaining, they're just simply going to be able to negotiate to get higher salaries. The defense budget is huge. We think a larger share of this should be going to the people who are actually doing the work. We think they probably get more benefits, etc. That's just really good for their daily lives, quality of life, etc. This is a pretty large demographic in the U.S., so we think that's great. Subpoint 2 here is on danger. We think that fundamentally being in the military, going into an active conflict zone is really bad for you as a person doing it. Why? Because it's really dangerous and you can die and you can get injured and you can get PTSD. All those things happen really frequently. We think that fundamentally the U.S. government is less likely to enter a conflict when they have to pay a larger human toll. If they want to enter a conflict that's really controversial and the union is opposing it, they're probably going to require to be paid a lot for it. Importantly, if the conflict is like widely supported, we don't think this happens. We can see a ton of people are willing to enlist during, say, World War II, regardless of the fact that wages are low, because they care about the cost. But during Vietnam, they have to go to the draft because not that many people want to enlist. I think if a conflict is controversial, that means that the union is going to demand higher wages to participate, if not like, and that means that they're going to have less of an incentive to do it because it becomes more costly to intervene. This just reduces the amount of unnecessary conflicts we see. That's probably really good for every military member who doesn't want to die in a war. Then subpoint 3 here is on culture and abuse. We see that the military has a culture of rampant abuse due to the hierarchy that's created when you just are taught to obey your leader no matter what. This is the reason that people are afraid to speak out when they're committing atrocities or when they're personally being victims of, like, say, rape, which is a massive problem for women in the military. We think that when you create a culture that puts everyone on the same playing field, they each have one vote in the union election, that starts to chip away at this rigid hierarchy and at least starts to give the idea that maybe you're not less valuable as a human than the people above you. We think that this gradually chips away at the culture of abuse, and it's also possible for the union to create other mechanisms to deal with this issue that, importantly, the U.S. government will never have an incentive to create. Insofar as like perpetuating this issue, like they don't want to like admit to they have an abuse problem, but the union might be able to actually make something happen here because it's such a big issue. Then our second contention is on impact to the world. First, basically an extension of the second subpoint in our first contention is that this reduces conflict because it now makes a higher human cost as well as a higher economic cost on intervening in foreign conflicts. The U.S. federal government is just less likely to do it. Why is that? Fundamentally, people care a lot about the government spending their money in ways that are perceived as unnecessary. We can look at like how mad people are over people sending money to the government sending money to Ukraine as an example of that. We'll make it a lot more expensive to enter unnecessary conflicts. Just kind of serves as like a check against the government entering these conflicts and probably makes them happen a lot less often. This is really good not only for people who are going into these conflicts, but also the victims of these conflicts. Right? We think that this probably reduces the frequency of like situations like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan in the coming decades. I think this is probably pretty good for the people in these countries that are going to face foreign intervention otherwise, as they now have better quality of life. They're not facing like a U.S. occupation, which we see like the vast majority of the time. U.S. intervention, especially like in places like the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, leads to worse consequences overall than would have happened if the U.S. simply hadn't gotten involved. Because they haven't like actually solved the problems there. Look at like the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's worse than we started. Then subpoint 2 here is on higher wages and better conditions elsewhere. What we see in the status quo is that because the military is always a job option for people, so it kind of creates a minimum standards for a lot of industries. Why? Because if you don't pay people better in the military, the vast majority of them can still join the military since they're always looking for new recruits. What happens when the conditions in the military get better and the pay gets better? That just means the minimum standard gets higher and people are able to demand better things from other employers. Why is this? Because now they can say, okay, well, if you won't pay me this X amount per year, I'll join the military instead. In the status quo, they can't do this when the military pay is a lot lower because they're not getting as much bargaining power out of this. We think this has the power to reshape the prices of the pay of people and the conditions that they get across the country. Importantly, this exists across the entire country, so it has a really powerful effect. Insofar as every person across the U.S. can join the military who's like over 18. It's a big amount of people that can benefit from this. This doesn't really happen with other jobs. It's kind of a unique way that we can improve working conditions for everyone. Then our C subpoint here is on how it signals the idea that signals about unions. What we see is there's a kind of a fundamental idea in the U.S. that unions are unpatriotic, that joining a union is against the good of the country and that we shouldn't do it. That's a bad thing to do. We think this combats that scenario. Why? Who's seen as the most patriotic people in society? It's our soldiers, people willing to serve our country and die for our country. When these soldiers are signaling that they're either joining or considering joining unions, that shows that unions are actually patriotic, that they're actually in the base of this country, and that they're a really, really good thing for this country, and that therefore it's a good thing for people to join because they see that it aligns with patriotic values. We think insofar this combats one of the main anti-union myths. We actually see unions are more common across the entire U.S. It also signals that the federal government supports at least the idea of unionization. This means companies are less likely to engage in union busting activities because now they see the federal government as pro-union. They believe they're less likely to be successful at doing these union busting activities, and workers are more likely to unionize because they believe the federal government will be on their side. We can see how in the aftermath of the auto workers strike, or of the Starbucks strikes and the federal government supporting the Starbucks workers, that led to a lot more strikes happening, and when all these strikes have been successful, that leads to even more unionization. I think this is the only way to increase unionization in the U.S., considering it's been progressively falling over the past century. It goes from 30% to 7% right now. I think it's going to keep falling unless we change something. We can probably change something by signaling that it's a part of our country, it's a good thing for our country, by making it associated with patriotism. People want to be patriotic, they're more likely to start unions, join unions, and grow unions and support unions. I think that's really, really good for your average American worker because they're going to get paid more, get better benefits, etc. For all these reasons, so proud to propose. We think this is the best way to not only help the soldiers, but also help everyone around them and help make this country better overall.
My name is Miriam from Ridge. I'm the first next speaker, and I use she, her pronouns. Is everyone ready to start? Cool. I'll begin my time starting now. I negate the resolution. The United States federal government should allow members of armed forces to unionize. So we just want to make it clear that under Title 10, so that includes armed forces as the Army, the Marine Corps, the Navy, the Air Force, the Space Force, the Coast Guard, and the National Guard. And so they don't really give us any framework in this debate, so we say we should evaluate it under structural oppression. Why? Because they evaluate it as what's going to help workers the most, what's going to bring up people who are marginalized in history. And we say that this is important because in order to level the playing field and to have impacts for everyone, everyone needs to be on the same page. That's why we propose structural oppression. Contention 1 is going to be coups. So the uniqueness of the A point is that military forces are currently beholden to the government and the status quo. Why? Because the commander-in-chief often has to command them to go abroad or to stay here or to go abroad for disaster relief, not even for fighting. But we say that in a world where you can unionize, that means that the military is likely to use that power to threaten the United States to do things. So first of all, what could that look like? One, that could look like the military staging a coup against the government.
Pause time for personal privilege.
Yes.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi's gone out, and so I can't flow. So it's gonna take a second.
Okay, no worries.
Pause the.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've paused you at 1 minute 3 seconds elapsed.
Cool.
Oh my God, what's going
You want to use my hotspot, maybe?
on? I'm gonna give it one more shot on this Wi-Fi network.
Okay.
And then. Oh, I did not save a fair amount of writing. I did.
Okay. I can restart.
Yeah, I think you have to restart. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Is there an objection to just basically go back a minute, restart the LSE?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to delete my flow.
Okay. Cool. Let me know when everyone's ready. Wait, did it work again?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay,
now.
cool. So should I start? Okay. I'll begin my 7 minutes, starting now. I negate the resolution. The United States federal government should allow members of armed forces to unionize. So just to reiterate the definition, armed forces include the Army, the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, the Space Force, the Coast Guard, and National Guard. And so we say framework should be structural oppression. The reason for that is because we think it aligns well with what they're arguing for. Unionizing often benefits wages for the underclass. We say that it's important to evaluate structural oppression in this round because in order to evaluate any fair impacts, everyone has to be on the same level playing field in the first place, which means that as a judge, you should look to what's going to help like people who are currently oppressed in the status quo. With that contention, one is going to be coups. So we say that the uniqueness is that one, military forces are beholden to the government and the commander-in-chief in the status quo. Why? Because they're the ones who have control over where to send the troops. So we say that they can decide when to send wars and when, like, where to wage wars, where to wage weapons, etc. But we say that the link is that in a world where you affirm the resolution and you allow them to unionize, that means that they can use their power to threaten the government itself. What that looks like is what it is, what happened in Myanmar. Even though the government was allowed to unionize, basically what happened is they used that union in 2007 to actually unionize and like go against the government. Essentially what they wanted was, to do was like included a lot of ethnic superiority like ideas, which are really bad. We say that like they included like the racial like supremacy, and that led to the genocide of the Rohingya. It was one of the things that led to that. So we see that oftentimes the military can like coalesce on a nationalistic level, and what that means is that they can then use that to overthrow the government. We say that this can often lead to a civil war, first of all, but second of all, we also say that this is like generally bad, that the military should be able to control any type of thing that like has control over policy in the government, right? Like the only way for the government to be able to make these policies is if they make educated decisions based on what is democratically true, right? So like if the people in a country want something, then the government should do that. We say that when you give the military bargaining power, they are, one, not elected by the people, two, don't lack the capacity and expertise necessary to make decisions or to threaten the government to do one thing or the other. So it gives them an unfair bargaining power. No other institution has that level of bargaining power over the government that is currently due. Like they might bring up like a private company. We say that this won't be as far-reaching as the entire commander-in-chief's control over a military. So we say those impacts of national fracturing are obviously going to outweigh. The second contention is going to be national security. So the 8 point here is the Army. We said that the Army is very key to relief assistance. For example, right now the Army is actually in Maui for fire relief, but also it's actually in several countries over on the Caribbean, including Haiti, to help like with the violence that's going on there. Also, you can look throughout history, right? Like in Little Rock 9, we set the National Guard there, and they were able to like help those 9 kids go into school. That was actually with one of the key points that helped Reconstruction, the National Guard being enlisted in the South. You can also look to 9/11 when the National Guard was able to calm people's fears in New York City. So we said that the National Guard is generally very important to be able to like provide relief assistance, or the Army in general to provide relief assistance, including the Coast Guard, which detects tsunamis throughout the Atlantic Ocean. So we say that them going on strike can often lead can be upward of 6 months, right? Like that would be like Hollywood strikes lasted for 8 months. We say that like 6 months is not even like a big stretch. A 6-month period can have several thousands of natural disasters. It can also lead to like escalations or nuclear attack or any type of attacks from weapons. And it's important that we have like security there. The B point is going to be the Marines. We said that in the South China Sea right now, we have several Coast Guard members that are actually deployed near Taiwan and near the Philippines. And the reason for this is to prevent any potential escalation of conflict. Without that, we see that China is likely to advance. And so we say that the presence of the military there acts as a deterrent. We tell you that this is going to be the brink scenario in this round, since that conflict can easily go nuclear, and extinction is going to outweigh any impact since we have to be alive in the first place. Then contention 3 is going to be the Space Force. So basically the argument here is that currently the private sector is populating a lot of the atmosphere with things like satellites and also debris. You can look to the fact that Elon Musk is actually looking to institute 10,000 satellites just in 2024 alone, and he has several more to go. We say that actually the only people who are regulating the atmosphere right now is the Space Force. Without that regulation, that allows any private company to basically do anything they want in the atmosphere. That includes terrible environmental impacts from rocket launches. So that's the impact. And the second impact is also going to be debris in space, which can lead to catastrophic impacts. So we say that you should prioritize a world in which like the environment is able to be kept. And we say that space basically destroys the entire ozone layer and is a reason to negate. Contention 4 4 is going to be impunity. We say that in the status quo, police use this impunity to cover up issues that happen within the police system. For example, if between 2008 and 2018, only 54 officers were charged with killings, despite police killings being in the thousands number, and several of them were unjust. But the reason why they aren't being prosecuted is because they can use impunity, which is basically that they threaten to go on strike if they try to attack a police department. So what happens is, like, if one police department did something very unethical, they'll say, oh, we'll go on strike, and now the government or the Department of Justice can't even do anything about that injustice. So we say that this same thing could transition into like the military, because what could happen in the military is like violence against specific, like if the military abuses its privileges in some way, they could go on strike to avoid any accountability, which is bad for structural oppression. Okay, I'll move on to the affirmative case now. So let's start on their plan. First of all, they don't give us a time frame, so you have to assume that it goes into effect right now. So we say that, like, insofar as there's several issues with this, look to the fact that the South China Sea can go nuclear at any point. You can also look to the fact that we have earthquakes at an all-time high. That's always going to outweigh. We say that we need the military now, we need relief assistance now, and we need the National Guard now. So a world in which you don't have that is always going to be worse than the potential increase of wages that some military members can get. Starting on the A point about how it would lead to higher salaries. So first of all, the first point is that there's other ways to get high salaries. Like, we've actually seen a raise in military salaries in the last 10 years. So we said that this solves for this. Second of all, we also see actually more wage increases than we do for minimum wage. Then the military experiences more wage increases than the average citizen. This solves for 100% of their impacts. We tell you that the military is actually likely to get more wages, especially as people are in this generation are being less inclined to join the military, which means that wages are going up because it's more scarce. So we say that wages are going up anyway, so it's non-unique. Then they talk about how the conflict is very controversial and they won't intervene. Okay, a couple of things here. This is going to be on the second connection, and that since it's kind of the same thing. So first of all, we would say sometimes intervention is very necessary, right? You can look to Bosnia with the genocide. That was clearly a time when the United States should have intervened. In fact, Bill Clinton, actually one of his biggest regrets throughout his presidency was not sending troops to Bosnia to prevent the genocide there. So we say that conflicts can often be important to intervene. Second, you can look to relief assistance. It is important to intervene in some type of scenario. They make some sort of blanket statement that it's U.S. intervention is always bad, but that is not the case. And we say that U.S. intervention can often be good, especially when it's more humanitarian missions that the Army does. Then they talk about how rape and how it chips away at the culture of abuse. This is not true also. Hollywood goes on strike every other year. We still see the toxic culture against women in Hollywood. It literally doesn't change anything. If anything, they just are forced to go back to work because employers are less likely to agree to it anyway. And so we don't see any tangible impacts coming out of that. Moving on to the last section they give you, which is that it helps the average worker. So a couple of things here. First of all, the military people in the military actually make more than the average minimum wage worker in the United States. So we say that people are still going to join the military. If joining the military was such a big incentive, people would have already joined it instead of working a minimum wage job. People obviously don't want to join the military for other reasons. So for those reasons, we negate. Thank you.
Off time, hi, I'm Zoe, a she, her pronouns, I'll be the second speaker for God. If everybody's ready, I'm going to start my time now. First on the framework, we agree to the framework, it's going to be op case in order, dot case in order. Let's start under C1 about coups. I think that they fundamentally misunderstand the different sources of power that the US military has and how these change in both worlds. Okay. I think the way that we should characterize here is that there's two different kinds of power, right? There's the military power. This is what they talk about when they talk about the military in Myanmar and the coup that existed there. And then there's also bargaining power for higher working conditions. I think that in the event of a coup, the kind of power that's being used there is the kind of power of we are the military and we have weapons. But the problem there is that exists on both sides of the house, right? And still, there hasn't been a coup from the military. If they wanted to have a coup, if they wanted to overthrow the government, they could do that just as well in the status quo because having a coup doesn't necessitate having a union first, right? They give you this example of Myanmar, but they fail to draw a link between the soldiers being able to unionize and there being a coup. If you look at a ton of other historical examples of coups, the soldiers aren't unionized first. There's not a direct link here because again, it's two different kinds of power. More collective bargaining power in terms of the wages that you get does not make you more likely to stage a coup. If anything, you can probably turn this because if you have better working conditions and you're more in favor of the US government, you are less likely to stage a violent armed revolt against them. Other examples of this include the Euro Mill plan, which is where a ton of the different militaries in the EU are unionized. We haven't seen military coups there. And you can also look to the U.S. police force, which is unionized and has weapons, but also isn't staging violent revolution against the government. I think it's pretty clear that their coup argument here is focusing on something that's totally different. It's a different kind of power that exists symmetrically. Yeah.
So insofar as the police departments tend to be like more state-based and like more sporadic than a national military would be, how would a police like how is that a fair comparison to say like the police could also stage a revolution and so could the military?
Okay, like you don't have to look at that example. You can look at the Euromill example of the militaries that are unionized in Europe. I think that it's clear that no matter what you buy on the police example, OP doesn't do enough characterization and analysis work here for you to buy that unionization is the tipping point for coups. If anything, you can turn it. Look to the analysis I give you. Then secondly, they talk to you about emergency relief. They tell you that like emergency relief is the most important thing. Two responses here. First, I don't think that they do enough analysis work as to why the emergency relief goes down on their side of the house, on our side of the house. If anything, we think you can turn that. Why is it? It's because we tell you, generally people don't like to intervene, and then Gov drops that. They tell you, sure, people probably don't want to go into military conflict. So what happens to the emergency relief? Probably it goes up. Because if the military has a finite amount of money to spend, and it's really expensive to send soldiers into active armed combat because none of them want to be there, instead of doing that, they're going to allocate their resources elsewhere, and more soldiers are probably more amenable to going to do like humanitarian relief where their lives aren't on the line and they get to feel like they're making a positive difference in people's lives. If anything, you probably see that crisis and disaster relief goes up on our side of the house. Okay, then third, they tell you about the Space Force. They tell you increasingly the private sector is getting power, but it is vital that the US government maintains some kind of control over space in order to regulate it. We tell you, exactly, you can turn this argument. It's actually a reason to vote Gov. Why? Because in the status quo, what's happening to all the people who understand space, who are engineers, or who would have the abilities that the US government needs, is that they all go into the private sector because it's way more profitable. We're not saying that the plan of unionization completely solves for that, but we do think it solves to an extent if you're getting higher wages, which OSHA tells you are, and then OP concedes that you are, and then also you're going to have better working conditions. That provides an additional incentive for people to work for the US government instead of for the private sector, which actually achieves the exact objective that OP wants. You can turn this argument here on the Space Force. Sure.
So even if the military were to experience like a marginal increase in wages, would you think that it would compare to like a high-class engineer, like in terms of salary?
Probably not, but there's other reasons why people might want to join the Space Force. I don't know, if it's more convenient for them, if their family has a history in the military. We do think that there are some outside incentives, but crucially, they're not getting any solvency here because in the status quo, the problem that they're talking about already happens. Maybe we're not making it much better, but we're certainly not making it worse when we provide additional incentives for people to work for the government instead, which is what OP tells you that they want. And finally, fourth, they tell you about impunity. They say that what's going to happen is that officers aren't charged with killings the same way. I'm going to give like a blanket response on their case in a second. Okay, and then on their fourth argument about impunity, they tell you people aren't going to be charged with doing bad things in much the same way that they're not charged with police force. Two responses. First, if you looked at the status quo, generally there are protections for members of the military, even beyond a union. That means that in general, people who are part of the US military forces aren't facing that much punishment. They aren't facing consequences for their actions. But then further, we think that you can turn this. Why? Because if you have soldiers going overseas less often, and if you're directing these people towards humanitarian aid instead, you're probably less likely to see these cases of impunity. The example that OP gives you is of soldiers killing other people. They're not going to kill other people if you're not sending them into an active war zone. I think that in general, OP is talking here about a scenario that we prevent on our side of the house. You're never going to be able to completely solve because there will always be protections for members of the military. It gets better on our side of the house where you put fewer people in scenarios where impunity is likely. Turn this argument. Now let's go to Gov's side of the flow. On our first contention, we tell you that there's a benefit here to members of the armed forces. First, we tell you that working conditions increase. OP gives you this non-interactive response, which is, okay, but they're already high enough in the status quo. The impact here is non-unique. The problem is that this isn't true. Even if the impact itself is non-unique, the extent to which the impact exists isn't. You would probably rather have better working conditions for people in the military. As OSHA tells you, yes, maybe it's going up, but still 5% of them live below the poverty line. They're not making enough to survive and to support their families. Just because people are making some money doesn't mean that they couldn't be making more money, that they couldn't have better working conditions. You can look here to the analysis that we give you on our third subpoint about abuse in the military, about rape and sexual violence. We think that certainly those kinds of these are problems that are not unique to the US military, but that exist to a larger extent in the military. If you have more protections for workers, that likelihood goes down. Okay, then secondly, we tell you the conflict is less likely, opt responds to this by telling you intervention is necessary in some cases. But I think it's really clear from the examples that they give you that things get better on our side of the house than on theirs. If you look to the example they give you, it's a Bosnian genocide. They tell you what should have happened is that the US should have intervened. What does that mean? It means that they're also not getting any solvency on times when intervention is necessary. And then all the examples OSHA gives you of times when intervention wasn't necessary are times when the US actually did intervene, when generally people in the military were against the war, they had to have a draft because people didn't want to enlist. And then in these times, that's when we saw conflict. That's what OP has to defend, is the status quo where the kinds of intervention we see are the unnecessary kind. On our side of the house, we warned you, that goes down. If people don't want to be in war, they don't want to serve, probably instead things get directed more towards a humanitarian crisis. What this would look like is, say it's like the Vietnam War. Instead of sending soldiers into Vietnam, there's more people who want to do humanitarian aid on our side of the house because people still want to help. They still want to stay in the army where they have good wages and good working conditions. So what they're going to do is they're going to redirect that effort towards humanitarian aid instead. Okay, then finally here on prevention of abuse happening to a greater extent when you have greater conditions for workers. OP gives you this blended response, which is, okay, but it happens in Hollywood. Sure, but in Hollywood, you're not part of like this huge mass of people who are all working together towards this shared goal. Clearly, there's differences here, and I think that when you have greater working conditions in general, you probably see that there's less abuse. One final response here to their case, and I think it's an important characterization, is on strikes. I think that what you have to buy is that humanitarian aid can probably exist in both worlds because the government has a huge incentive to make sure that even if the military says, like, oh, we're going to strike, they're going to shut it down as quickly as possible because they know that they want to like, prevent lives from being lost because it reflects poorly on them. For all these reasons,
we're all good? Then I'll start now. Just as an overview on the round, like we're talking about structural oppression. So what are the big problems that each side says? The government tells you that like the biggest structural oppression problem they're solving is raising wages. The opposition tells you that like increasing power to the armed forces can lead to a military coup and like to things like genocide, like it happened in Myanmar. This is a much bigger magnitude where like genocide is the worst form of structural oppression versus like 5% of military people in the military are in poverty. Like, are you serious? Like, the scope is so small. Further, they also dropped the timing way that Miriam told you, which is that right now, like, there's lots of tensions in the South China Sea, and the BRICS scenario is that right now the United States is cooling those tensions by telling China, like, there is a deterrence there. If those people do go on strike, that means that this war could really hurt like the poor people living there. Okay, now let's look at the opposition case. Our first contention is about coups, and our argument is that if you increase the power given to the military, they're going to use that to threaten the government and create a military state, or could, like they did in Myanmar, where they created a racial supremacy that led to the Rohingya genocide. They tell you a few things. First of all, like, oh, it's actually a different type of power, like they just get bargaining power. But there's two things here that get different when you get unionized. First of all, they pay union dues, which means that the power of the union increases because it means the workers are able to go on strike because they know their wages are insured, right? Like, okay, maybe the U.S. government won't pay me when I'm on strike, but my union will, which means that they're more likely to take action. Second of all, they also have more organizational structures. Like, we tell you that if there's more organization, like right now it's really hard to like form a strike, but when you're in a union, it's much easier. We tell you that a 1% chance of genocide is so much worse than possibly raising the wages for 5% of people, right? Especially given the fact that they're talking about like, oh, it's going to be a vote every year. We tell you that like if you're voting, a majority of United States workers are not unionized, even if a union could help them. Further, if it's every year, there's a very large probability that the union will stop existing every year. So there's no guaranteed solvency that anything in the government is saying. With little solvency and tiny scope, you should just presume the negative on this marginal impact or the marginal probability of like a military state. Our second contention is national security. Our argument is that like the National Guard and the Coast Guard are crucial to national security. They provide relief assistance to Maui, Haiti, and they even domestic problems like the Little Rock Nine. We tell you that the Coast Guard is super important. They're good at like detecting things like tsunamis and telling like people on like poor low-lying communities that they need to help. They tell you like, oh, actually this isn't going to go down. They're going to intervene more. Like, I'm really confused on what they're saying here. I think you should believe the Warren
warranting, they tell you that intervention is going to go down because people don't want to do this. I would argue that, just one moment, I would argue that like, even if like a relief assistance isn't necessarily like, it's not the same as a war, right? But it's still marginally dangerous. Like there's fire, or they're protecting them from some military struggle, which means that the unionized workers are going to protest going to the intervention, and we tell you that when you're like saying, are they going to intervene more or less, you should presume that they're going to intervene less. Furthermore, if they're intervening less, you can turn this to our side, especially in their second contention about world conflict, that if we are sending less troops, we're more likely to send things like weapons, or just like throw money, or like throw weapons like to those people, like autonomous weapons. That is so much worse than just sending those people, because it's much more dangerous. Yeah, I'll take the POI.
Yeah, considering that active members of the armed forces have to do something, don't you think that they're going to be able to do the incentive analysis to understand that humanitarian aid is comparatively going to be less dangerous for them?
No, I would say that people are self-interested, and I believe you're warranting when you say people don't want to do something that is dangerous. I think even relief assistance, though it is necessary, is still dangerous, and they're going to protest doing that. I don't know why you're trying to like shift out of this argument now. Our third contention was about the Space Force, and they misunderstand the argument. Our argument is that if like the Space Force were to go on strike, that's really bad because the private sector would be able to exploit that and like flood it with satellites, which impedes our ability to military safeness and detecting natural disasters. They misunderstand. They say, well, obviously they're not going to join the private sector. That's not what we're saying. And so you should extend that through. We say that like the U.S. Space Force is really important because it uses our materials in space in order to detect like climate disasters. Climate disasters more often, like something like flood, is more likely to hurt low-lying communities, which is bad for structural oppression. They don't have a response to that. Don't let them give you a new one in PMR. Our fourth contention is impunity. You can also extend this one, which is the argument that like scandals are more likely to happen or not going to happen because the military is going to protect those workers. They say there's still protections. I would say they put themselves in a double bind on sexual abuse there. So either A, there's protections against like sexual abuse that are happening in the status quo and they fail, or B, there aren't, and you can't unionize because it means the military is always going to want to avoid a union and is always going to protect the predator predator of the crime, like the sexual abuser. Now let's look at the government case. On their first contention about salaries, remember Miriam gives you this argument that even if they do strike, there's no guarantee of it even happening. And their only response is, oh no, Hollywood is a bad example. How is that a bad example? Like SAG-AFTRA is a huge union that recently went on strike for 8 months, not at this time, and it did not lead to all of the things that they were hoping for. But that is terminal defense of the government. We've proven to you that A, union is unlikely. B, even if a union does happen, it's likely to go out because they're just going to vote it out. 3, a union strike is actually really bad because it leads to increased autonomous weapons, and it leads to us being really it leads to the South China Sea being vulnerable. It leads to space being vulnerable. But D, we tell you that even if they are able to go on strike, that doesn't even mean that they're going to find all the things that they're looking for. On their second contention about world conflict, they tell you we just need a draft if something's really bad like Bosnia. Okay, that's a terrible idea because drafting people makes them extremely angry. Why would you want people who are very angry at the government for forcing them to go to war? Why would you want them to join a union where they get even more power? That is a direct link in to our first contention about a military coup, that if you force people to go to, that there's a scenario that they don't want to intervene, right? They are going to protest intervening. So if you force them to intervene and you send them over anyway, they're going to get even more angry. Then the next thing they tell you is aid exists, so we don't even need to send troops. I would argue that throwing money at a problem is very rarely the solution, and that a lot of times there's structural problems there that the United States troops would be better at solving. Lastly, let's just we can just weigh this debate. I would argue that every single one of the government impacts are not only so improbable because they've hinged the entire debate on the possibility of a union forming, which, as we know, looking at the percent of the United States workforce that's unionized, is very improbable. They said it's going to happen every year, and they say the only people that they are helping is 5% of the military. When you compare that to current vulnerable populations in the South China Sea, current vulnerable populations in America that would be at risk of a racial hierarchy or supremacy if the military coup were to happen, and any chance of war or climate change which would hurt would disproportionately hurt marginalized communities, I don't understand how an affirmative ballot could possibly happen. And for those reasons, we strongly negate.
start my 4 minutes starting now. Okay, so let's look at some of the offense that comes from the affirmative side, and let's weigh it against our case. So that's what the majority of this speech will be. So first we'll start with probability. So looking at the affirmative case, let's look at what are the most probable scenarios that are likely to happen. First of all, look to the analysis Lucy gives you, which is that only 7% of the workforce is currently unionized, even though they have the opportunity to unionize. So in order for you to buy any of the affirmative offense, you first have to buy that they're going to unionize in the first place, even if the plan is passed and they are allowed to unionize. So first of all, you should automatically presume neg on that because there's a 93% chance they aren't going to unionize. That takes away a bunch of their offense. But the second probability argument here is going to be that war is going to exist in either scenario. Look to the fact that the autonomous weapons argument is basically going to win us this round. Here's why. We tell you that the United States federal government often sends autonomous weapons or drones to like the Middle East, right? Instead of actually sending manned soldiers. So we tell you that even if they go on strike, that means that Biden is just going to start sending more drones or more strikes abroad. Why is that uniquely worse? We'll give you a couple of reasons why that's uniquely worse. One, drones are worse because they're less precise. So we tell you that it's actually probably better. Yeah, sure.
I think these like warrants on why drones are worse are completely down.
Lucy.
I think I made arguments why sending autonomous weapons is bad. Maybe she's explaining them a little more than I did. I don't know. It's up to you guys.
We will discreet, I suppose, since I can't speak for the whole panel.
We will. Sorry. Oh, so.
Because it's judge's discretion,
Oh.
so it's a little joke. We'll discreet.
Oh, got it. Okay. Okay, I'll resume my time starting now. Regardless of whether you buy the impacts on that, Lucy still made the argument. So we said that war is going to happen in either scenario. Even if war isn't worse, it's still going to happen. So that's another reason why their contention 2 is out the window, because we tell you they specifically say that foreign conflicts are going to reduce. We say that no, foreign conflicts are at best, sure, they're going to stay the same because we're just going to send drones abroad instead of manned soldiers, because we're already doing that in the status quo anyway. So we tell you that, so with that in mind, like let's move on to some of the other probability impacts. So we tell you that even if there's a 1% chance that the South China Sea conflict goes nuclear, that's a reason to negate. Here's why. We tell you that right now there's several like tensions. You can look to even Russia and Ukraine. Putin has threatened to use a nuclear weapon, right? Like we tell you there are several nuclear like potentials for nuclear conflict throughout the world. We tell you that if the United States were to go on, if the United States military were to go on strike, that automatically means that we are put in a vulnerable position. That means that they were unable to fight, right? So like, sure, maybe they're going to say like, oh, that's very improbable, but we tell you that you should weigh that against a 5% wage increase, like for 1 year. We said that the impact is extremely marginal. You're looking at a 350 million population in the United States, and you're comparing that with a small fraction that is part of the military. That sure, maybe will make a few dollars like per hour. And then second of all, you can look to relief assistance. Like that's like on probability, that's already happening. So you should look to like continuing that. Look to the fact that the plan is going to go into effect right now. We're currently like doing a lot of disaster relief abroad, and any vote for the affirmative would basically just like take a knife to that, because now we can no longer do any of that disaster relief. Disaster relief completely outweighs because of structural oppression. We tell you that vulnerable populations are the most likely to be attacked by like any type of disaster. So you should vote on that. And then on like, so basically just to like crystallize this a little bit on their flow, so on their third contention, that still goes with like increasing wages. Look to the fact that only 7% of people are in wages. Then you can also, like they make it like one like flippy argument here about how governments will probably just listen to them if they threaten. We say like, no, that's not true.
Yeah, well, the argument that like the strike isn't going to happen because the government will listen is like the final line of the MG. We don't get any response in that amount.
Wait, what? Yeah, so you guys made that argument in your
MG, and we didn't get a response in that. So this is a new response.
You do have a chance to respond.
Yeah, you can explain if it's on the flow
Do
previously.
you want to explain? I think
I'm confused.
I had it as a response on the third contention about how the governments will benefit if they threaten, and then I think Lucy said that the military. She explained the double bind argument, which was a complete direct refutation to that.
It wasn't. That's not like it wasn't characterized as a refutation.
I do not remember hearing the words double bind, and I'm not so good at debate terminology. So if you could refer me to the specific argument made.
It was on the third contention about the double bind, right?
About the autonomous weapons? About the intervention? Where are we?
No, wait. Yeah, on foreign intervention, but no, not on
The,
foreign
the
intervention.
possibility of a strike
The
is where we
possibility
are
of
on the
strike
floor.
with
The end of
wages on
MG,
something about
and
wages.
was there a
You know
response
how
in
you
the
were
MO
talking about
as
how they're
well?
in a double bind?
I'm sorry.
Did the other judges hear the word double bind?
I did.
You did.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
did. But what is the argument trying to make now? Just remind me. What are you?
So basically, they had said that governments will probably benefit, like, will probably just listen to them if they're threatened.
Okay.
But we're trying to say that, like, no, that's not the case because of the double bind.
Oh, we talked about Hollywood. Is that not what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying.
Okay, I
Okay.
can't help you.
I am personally ready to take it under consideration,
Yes.
and I will
Yes.
not
We should
indicate
move
how
on.
I'm
We'll
leaning for the
consider.
right.
Okay, cool. So I'll resume my time at 3:16. Okay, cool. So on magnitude, you should look to the fact that even if there's a potential that the government won't listen, like sure, maybe that's their best argument that the government will listen if they're threatened, right? Weigh that against our possibilities. Our government is inefficient. Let's say they don't listen. What will happen then? Well, there's a 1% chance that we might go to nuclear war, and we say that extinction is always going to outweigh because we can't do anything or even have this debate if we're extinct in the first place. So we say that's going to outweigh. The second reason you can vote on magnitude is going to be the Space Force. We say they're super behind on this argument, and they basically don't really give us any responses. We tell you that this is going to outweigh on like time frame because Elon Musk is putting 10,000 satellites into space right now. Any risk of one collision of them could literally lead to our entire grid going black. So we tell you that the US Space Force is actually the only one preventing that. So that's why you should vote for us, because we tell you that the Space Force is the only one regulating that. Thank you.
Okay. If
Hold on. Okay. Good.
Okay. If everyone's ready, I'll begin my time. Now, first I want to highlight, Judge, we're operating under this debate under a structural violence framework. That means impact on developing nations are going to be super, super important insofar as they're structurally oppressed. Both sides agree on that. I just think it's important to point out. First, I want to deal with this question of like whether the union is going to happen. Ops seems to think that this is a winning argument because they say 93% of the time union doesn't happen. First of all, we don't think that's true, but if that is true, why is that still good for us? Because if it were in that 93% of the time, that means that basically gov case is off case except for one thing. Our signaling contention that I read you as the first subpoint of our second contention, which tells you that the federal government is supporting the unions, and that makes unions look good and patriotic. That's the only like delta then we're clearly winning. That they tell you that's the majority of the time. Now let's look at the 7% because like that's where it's more ambiguous. I'll show you why we're still winning in that 7%. We've already won the debate insofar as they tell you we win 93% of the time. Obviously everything else dealing with how the union gets implemented is a complete wash. Then let's look at the 7%. First, on this idea about like whether coups are going to happen, as Zoe tells you, coups can happen right now. There's no link between the union and the coup. When they try to give you a link, like they end up just talking about the strikes instead. They actually never give you a link on how the union makes the coup more likely, except for this one about how union dues are going to lead to a coup. But we don't see how this happens insofar as like the union dues are to be paid in the case of a strike, not to be used for a coup. Also, like we probably see that like the union dues aren't that much. They're not enough to like finance a whole coup. That like you couldn't already just have the coup. If you wanted a coup, I don't think it's because you don't have $100 in your bank account.
We think we think
Yeah.
the argument about how your like union dues are not enough to finance a whole coup is new.
It is new because it's a new response to the union dues, which are brought up for the first time in the
I'm sure judges disagree.
yeah, so I'm going to continue now. So what do we see? We see that the coup is no more likely to happen in their world. That's the same reason that like there just hasn't been a coup in Europe. They both do that example. Then let's look at like strikes. This is basically where they access all their impacts. They need to prove that strikes are going to happen because their link on the Space Force thing and their link on China nukes is based on strikes. But what we tell you in MG, is that strikes do not happen because the U.S. government knows these things too. The U.S. government knows that if the entire military goes on strike, that's really bad for their self-defense, and also they don't want to be like killed in this mass extinction event. So what happens? Then the U.S. government is simply not going to allow them to go on strike. They're just going to like acquiesce to the demands. They're just going to like make a deal, right? That's what happens when like doctors threaten to go on strike because the country doesn't want to have no doctors. The same thing as when the federal government intervenes and say like the auto workers because it's bad for the country when the auto workers are all on strike, or the trains. They prevent the trains from going on strike. What we see is that fundamentally we have a reason that the strikes won't happen. That was like we never get any response from them. The only response we get is like bureaucracy. Like sure, bureaucracy does exist, but we don't think they're so like bureaucratic that they're not going to realize that they don't want themselves to go extinct and they don't want the entire military to go on strike. I think they can probably figure this out. They did it with the trains. Also, they'll just give warning for going on strike because obviously the military looks bad if they go on strike and cause mass extinction. So they don't want that. They'll just give like a week and like can we negotiate before we have to go on strike. We think that's pretty obviously solves that entire thing. That takes out all of their offense on China, all of their offense in space. Also, we think mutually assured destruction solves anyway. Then on aid, we think that they say like, oh, if you might have to pay them a little extra to go do this humanitarian aid, we think that's true, but we think you have extra money because you're not intervening in so many foreign conflicts. It probably washes out. Then on impunity, we think that most people in the military aren't predators, so they might vote for policies that create like more protections, but like we think that also probably washes out. That means there's no offense left on the opposition side of the flow, even in the 7% of cases. But why are we really winning your ballot on that 7% of cases? Because what we tell you is that fundamentally we prevent foreign intervention into these developing nations. They talk about Bosnia. The problem is they don't solve Bosnia, we don't solve Bosnia, but at least we prevent Afghanistan and we prevent other intervention in the Middle East that's happened in the past few decades. Because when the government wants to intervene somewhere and the military doesn't support it, we make sure that that doesn't happen because it just isn't economically feasible. They talk about drones, but the thing is you still have to make the drones and operate the drones, and that takes humans. If these humans demand to be paid a lot more, it still changes the economic calculus. It makes it less profitable to go to war. We're not saying we prevent all U.S. foreign military intervention, but we do think we prevent the unpopular ones at least some of the time. This is the biggest impact in this round of the structural violence framework. It's also basically guaranteed to happen. We're not relying on a brink case scenario to access this impact. It's pretty intuitive that when it becomes more expensive to send people into war zones, you're less likely to do it since the government cares about money. We never get really like reputation on the link level about how the government cares about doing things that are economical and they're less likely to intervene if it's more expensive. So we think that completely flows through. So far as this actively leads to like the complete destruction of developing nations when the U.S. intervenes and fails, we prevent this from happening. Under the structural violence framework, we basically help these people in developing nations avoid the genocides they talk about, some of which are caused by the U.S. military. So what does this mean? It means that effectively we're winning that entire point. And then on the point about how like the other point I think we're winning here, and that's really, really big impact, is on the idea that we're going to see better wages and better like pay for everyone. Even if the military isn't paying more than your average American job, what we see is that because their military has to be balanced with another cost, the cost of potentially dying in conflict, when like the option of the military becomes better and the pay in the military becomes better, that still makes it more desirable. Say someone was getting paid $40,000 a year and the military was paying $30,000 a year, but you have to risk your life. Now, if the military gets paid $40,000 a year plus they have to risk their life, they can go to their boss and say, how much are you going to pay me as like extra because I should be getting paid as the same amount as someone risking their life, and they can probably get paid $50,000. We can see how that leads to better wages for everyone because what we think is that the military acts as this kind of like thing everyone in the country can bargain off of and leads wages to go up in general. Fundamentally, it doesn't mean that they have to be paid like they don't have to be getting paid less than the military to begin with to be able to access this like benefit basically. What does that mean? That means we have better working conditions across the country. And also, even in the case where like the union does happen, we still get to flow through our entire signaling point where we tell you that this makes unions look more patriotic. Insofar as the vast majority of Americans aren't in the military, we get the rest of them better working conditions and help with them unionization. That's super important. Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone for a great round. So wonderful to see people debating well. We'll deliberate without talking to each other, very tragically. You can leave. I guess you can stay because we can't talk to each other, but maybe you want to walk around or something.
Thank you guys for joining. Great. Thank you so much for having me.
I'll just keep the recording running. I don't want to do it twice.
You can turn you can turn it off.
They wanted the decisions to be recorded. Are you okay with that?
I'm fine with it. You can.
Just do another one?
Yeah, I would do another one.
Save some memory. For Gov, congratulations. I'm the squirrel, so I'm going to disclose the op ballot very briefly. Very, very small risk. A few conditional possibilities in my ballot. I'm going to talk fast because Tab will get mad at me if I talk for more than 5 minutes. 1, does the military unionize? Probably not. It's a 7% chance. Does the military strike? Probably not. The government is risk averse and is aware that strike the internal link to not striking is government knows and everyone knows that strike means extinction. Is probably not enough to outweigh the scenario in which unionization does happen, 7%. Strikes, eliminating deterrence against China and Russia and probably creating global nuclear conflict between the United States and Russia. Around 1%. Probably not. I would need significant Gov offense to outweigh this. Gov tells me 1, non-military workers. There's the signaling argument in the 93% world where unionization doesn't happen, and so it just looks like the government has changed a regulation to be pro-union. This means that there is some degree of unquantified, and I think unquantifiable, improvement in the labor movement. Additionally, this might mean and then if unionization happens, higher wages in the military mean people can quit low-paying jobs. Second possible Gov ballot is change in military policy and eliminating bad interventions. Every single time, and I really like this ballot, but every single time I try to weigh it, it seems to just raise the chances of voting for the op ballot. My reasoning for this is that the internal link is that the military will hold out and say, we're not going to go fight that war. Deterring China sounds terrible. Standing in the firing line sounds terrible, which means the United States doesn't deter China, which means China continues to expand, leading to greater likelihood of brinksmanship, greater likelihood of conflict, which is, I think, broadly conceded by both sides in the debate. Any U.S.-China conflict appears likely to become a nuclear conflict. To the extent that that is just a global extinction risk, and the likeliest case scenario is like a change in a regulation that leads to a small increase in rate of unionization doesn't feel like enough for me to outweigh an extinction risk, and that's why I vote op in this debate. I'm going to turn it over to Clarity and Avi for the gov ballots.
True. Okay, you all. What's going on here? Firstly, I'm just going to go down kind of major stuff in the round. Firstly, framework. This doesn't matter because you agree on the framework, but also I think there are really lovely and true arguments as to why structural oppression ought to be uniquely valued, but those arguments are not like made within this round. It's basically just net benefits. Apparently, every group that's affected is structurally oppressed, so it really does not matter. But you all can do better. First, on this 93 versus 7%, one, in 93% of cases, I buy it's better for gov because of like unionization stuff, and I think the only weighing that happens in this round really is that you should care about the 93% more than actually from the opposition. You should care about the 93%. The 93% is like the number one scenario that ought to be valued. And I think that's basically agreed upon. So insofar as both sides agree the 93% ought to be valued and the 93% is better for gov, I give this round to the government. On the 7%, I don't think it's well enough explained, like, on the possibility of striking. To be honest, I don't think that there's like a possibility. I just think the argument is refuted, and so I don't weigh it at all, right? I think that I don't believe that there's like a 1% of the 7%. I just think it's not going to happen because the argument was refuted on the flow. If you explained like there's the possibility, people are rational, you never know, if that kind of thing was given, then I'd be like, oh, okay, maybe. But also I don't think you do well enough weighing on magnitude. You just kind of say the words magnitude a lot, but that's not really weighing. So I'm inclined not to just think about that at all. And so similarly, all the other negative strike impacts that might happen, I think there's just the strike is not going to happen because people are basically rational actors. I don't ever have anything in this round that makes me think people aren't rational actors. I get the POI on selflessness versus selfishness within kind of military members. And so I'm inclined to think that intervention maybe goes down across the board. But because the United States military apparently does good things and bad things, who would have thought? And I don't actually get any weighing as to whether like the good things are more important than the bad things that the military does. I say, oh, okay, that's even. Who knows? No matter what the military does, they're doing more or less, and they do good and evil. Who knows? What's going on there? So I guess increasing unionization rates and giving people better salaries is probably good and fine. And so even in the 7% situation, I say yes. On the impunity point, which I thought opposition was kind of their main thing that remained in the 7%, the idea that impunity exists within the status quo and it's just going to be a wash, I think, was basically unrefuted, so I don't really count that. Yeah.
Okay.
Y'all should be aware that the quarter is carrying out now.
Okay.
One probably needs to go.
Okay. I'll give you sort of a condensed version. I have to say up front, this did not go as I was expecting, to be honest with you, at all. On op, I have no idea why you chose structural oppression. What does that even mean? Like, does that mean exploiting military personnel? Does that mean exploiting third world countries? Like, I never got really an explanation of what that was. How about just a functioning military, or like, what's the purpose of the military? And I think, honestly, like, I really thought this was very op-skewed, and I'm really shocked that I ended up voting for Gov. But like, what is structural? I didn't know what that meant. Okay, so military personnel unionize. Okay. Then you set up a situation where who are actually the workers? Maybe that's the enlisted people. Who's management? Is that the generals? Is that the politicians? And so if it's the generals, like, why is there really like a more likely scenario for a coup? Like, just seems probably not, quite frankly. But anyway, I mean, who should decide who goes to war? Should it be someone elected, or should it be like, some unelected, union? Like, I got none of that argumentation from you. I got none of this, so I just didn't really. So I had to go with kind of what was sort of given to me. Coups, again, with at least some of the management not being sort of in the union, I don't see why. Actually, it seems less likely, quite frankly, there'd be coups. On aid, I don't really see why it's affected at all. You don't make the direct link to strikes. Government actually, I think, did that for you. You did a little bit in first speech, but how about just make it more clear, our adversaries can start a war when there's a strike. Like, I don't know, I never even got that from op. by the way, from Gov, there is like air traffic control is a union, but they're not allowed to strike. Like you could have actually kind of brought that into the sort of argumentation, which you didn't. But I don't understand the whole idea of like, we're more likely to be a war. This is kind of what the other judge kind of voted on. Like, how is that structural oppression? Like, so I didn't even know how to vote for you on that. Anyway, the most structural oppression thing I heard in the whole round was about like, that they pay very badly and that you're more likely to get paid. And so at the end of the day, that was the vote.
Thank you all. Yes, thank you all. Really high level, wonderful ground. Guess we can stop.
These are yours. Congratulations.